Hello and welcome to this webinar series from Restore America's Estuaries about the first blue carbon conservation methodology. My name is Hillary Stevens. I'm the Coastal Resilience Manager at REDD, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar to announce our new methodology. And I'll get right into it. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists here today to present their work. A bit about Restore America's Estuaries. We are a membership alliance organization of 10 member groups that you see here located around the continental US. They are working to protect and restore their local coastal resources. And we serve as a convener and an advocate for these groups and for all people working in their local coastal areas. We are located in Washington, D.C., and do serve an advocacy role in the nation's capital. A little bit of context about this project. REDD has been working in the blue carbon area for many years now. In 2015, we worked to develop the VM33 methodology, which was for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration. Once that was completed, we recognized that there was a further need for a methodology for conservation of these types of habitats. And so we have been working on the REDD+ Methodology Framework to build an additional module in that framework that would cover tidal wetlands. This event today will be focusing on that new module. It does kind of assume that you have a background in the carbon verification standards and some understanding of REDD+. If at the end of this webinar you have more questions, you would like a little bit more background, I encourage you to take a look at our website, estuaries.org. There are some additional resources and guidebooks there that can help you get up to speed. If you have a project idea of something you would like to work on, I definitely encourage you to get in touch with me or with any of our speakers today, as we would be very happy to work with you. I want to take a moment to thank all of the supporters that we have had in this project. We would not be where we are today without them. A number of these organizations have provided expertise, advice, and financial support as we developed and validated this methodology. I also must thank all of our contributing authors. Some of them are here today, but not all of them. And those of them that were not able to make it today, we are deeply indebted for their expertise and contributions. With that, let me introduce the speakers today. Again, my name is Hillary Stevens. Next, we will hear from Amy Schmidt, who is with Verra. Then we will go on to the panelists who developed this methodology. They are Steve Crooks, Igino Emmer, and Steve Emmett Mattox. Amy Schmidt is the Manager of Natural Climate Solutions Development at Verra. Igino Emmer has been working in the field of land use and climate change since the early 1990s. He's the founder of the European branch and forerunner of Silvestrum Climate Associates. Steve Emmett Mattox used to work with REDD, and he launched the National Blue Carbon Program and led the development of the VM33, which I mentioned earlier, and this methodology. He is currently the president of Strategic Collaborations Consulting Group. Steve Crooks is the principal wetland science and coastal management at Silvestrum and is co-founder of the International Blue Carbon Initiative. This is truly a panel that does not need much introduction in this field. With that, I want to thank you again for attending, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Amy Schmidt at Verra. And I am looking at the registration numbers, and I will say we may hit capacity for this event today. If anyone you know was not able to attend, we will be recording this event and posting it at our YouTube channel, which just go to YouTube and search for Restore America's Estuaries, and within a few days we'll have that video posted. Because there are so many folks in attendance, we have put everyone on mute. If you have an issue or a question, please either raise your hand or use the question box on the right side of your panel to submit those. And if we have time at the end, I will take some of those questions and read them aloud so that everyone hears the questions and then allow the panelists to answer them. So with that, let me hand the mic over to Amy Schmidt.
Thanks, Hillary, and everyone should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we've got you. Go right ahead.
Okay, so as Hillary mentioned, I'm the manager of Natural Climate Solutions Development at Verra, and I also lead our work on blue carbon more broadly. So to start off, I'm going to give a brief intro to who Verra is. So we're a nonprofit organization that manages and develops standards and frameworks for climate action and sustainable development goals, including the Verified Carbon Standard program. So the VCS is the world's most widely used voluntary greenhouse gas program, and it's the program that this methodology was developed under. So under the VCS, there are a number of different pillars to ensure that any of the greenhouse gas benefits that are issued as verified carbon units or VCUs are done robustly and represent real emission reductions or removals. So these include our core program requirements set out in the VCS standard, independent auditing of all methodologies and projects, and a transparent registry system. But today we'll be focusing on accounting methodologies, since this is a blue carbon methodology. So under the VCS program, accounting methodologies form a really core function in that they allow projects to quantify the emission reductions and removals that they achieve. And all methodologies include a number of different components set out here that enable them to do this. So these include applicability conditions that set which activities the methodology applies to, the project boundary that defines the greenhouse gas emission sources and carbon stocks and pools that a project can claim under their greenhouse gas benefit. Methodologies also set out procedures by which projects set the baseline scenario or the scenario of what would have happened in the absence of project activities, and procedures for how projects can demonstrate additionality to demonstrate that the project activity would not have occurred in the absence of carbon finance. And finally, methodologies set out procedures and specific equations for how projects quantify their emission reductions and removals that can be issued as carbon credits, and also specific procedures for how projects are required to monitor the implementation to ensure that their activities can be verified, and therefore the greenhouse gas benefits can be issued as carbon credits. So this revision to a methodology, like all of our methodologies, goes through a methodology approval process that consists of the high-level steps set out here. So a few years ago at this point, Verra reviewed and approved the concept of this methodology revision. It also underwent a review of the draft documentation and a 30-day public comment period. For the approval process, normally it involves the assessment of the methodology by two independent validation and verification bodies, which are independent auditors. And in this case, Verra decided, along with Restore America's Estuaries, to actually pilot an alternative methodology approval process where there were actually 3 independent VVBs involved in the assessment of the methodology. And finally, there was one last review by Verra, and we officially approved the methodology for use earlier this month. So as Hillary mentioned, this is a revision to an existing VCS REDD methodology. So our REDD+ methodology framework is a modular methodology that applies to a number of different REDD+ activities. And what we mean by a modular methodology is that the methodology itself allows for these many different activities, and then there are separate module documents that set out specific components of the methodology, such as the baseline scenario or quantification for different activities that are covered. So prior to this revision, the methodology covered avoided, planned, and unplanned deforestation, reduced forest degradation, afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation activities, as well as avoided, planned, and unplanned peatland degradation and peatland restoration. And as part of this revision that we'll be going into more detail, avoided, planned, and unplanned tidal wetland degradation and tidal wetland restoration have been added as applicable activities. So this revision was built upon a lot of the concepts and procedures that were included in the existing methodology for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration, or VM33, under the VCS program, and expanded to also include conservation. So within the methodology itself, there are 3 new modules that are specific to tidal wetland activities, and 13 existing modules were revised to also support these activities. So there's a lot of kind of referencing between the modules for different components of the methodology. From the procedures and components of the VM33 methodology, there were a few kind of improvements or streamlining things done to those procedures when they were incorporated into VM7. And so we are also considering how to add those kind of improvements into VM33 for any of you who are already familiar with that methodology. And lastly, before I pass it over to our other panelists, I want to mention Verra's blue carbon work in general. So we see tidal ecosystems as being very important for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so we are currently running a blue carbon working group that has the objectives of exploring key barriers and opportunities for tidal wetland conservation and restoration activities, and finding ways to address those barriers or to move those opportunities forward in terms of how standards can better support those activities. And so we see this conservation methodology as being extremely important to unlocking carbon finance for tidal wetland conservation activities. And with that, I will pass the screen back over and pass it over to Steve Emmett Mattox.
Okay, thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Amy. My name is Steve Emmett Mattox, and I'll be talking about 2 things: the applicability conditions and additionality. As described already a little bit, the purpose of the methodology revision is to bring new funding and interest to coastal wetland conservation and restoration, and to utilize restoration and conservation as nature-based approaches to combating climate change. These are critically threatened ecosystems with large global potential for restoration of already degraded areas. You can go to the next slide, please. Every methodology has applicability or eligibility requirements, as Amy mentioned. The REDD+ Methodology Framework sets out the primary applicability conditions for each of the project categories, including wetland restoration and conservation. There are also applicability conditions for each module that must be met, except for the tidal wetland baseline and monitoring modules. I'll be reviewing the WRC applicability conditions here. Next slide, please. WRC, Wetland Restoration and Conservation, encompasses restoring wetland ecosystems, RWE, and conservation of intact wetlands, CIW. I want to note that when we use the term tidal wetlands, we also mean seagrass meadows. This is a tidal wetland and seagrass meadow methodology for both restoration and conservation. Next slide. Tidal wetland restoration encompasses hydrologic restoration, restoration of the soils or sediment, and/or restoration of native vegetation, and any combination of these. It also includes restoring salinity to tidally restricted areas, improving water quality, primarily to improve seagrass meadows, as well as a wide range of improved management practices. Next slide. The conservation of intact wetlands, including tidal wetlands and seagrass meadows, may include a wide range of protection strategies such as conservation easements and new regulations, as well as improving management, improving water quality, preventing water supply or sediment supply disruption, sediment recharge, and allowing for the landward migration of wetlands with sea level rise. Taken all together, if you consider the eligible restoration activities as well as the eligible conservation activities, you can see it is a broad-reaching methodology. Next slide, please. Projects that lower the water table are not eligible unless the project is specifically converting open water to tidal wetlands or improves a connection to impounded waters. And the project cannot create an increase in greenhouse gas emissions in hydrologically connected adjacent areas. Next slide, please. As we know, wetlands are significant for their ability to store carbon in soils. To use this methodology, the project must either result in the accumulation or maintenance of soil organic carbon stock or increase salinity to reduce methane emissions. That is, projects that restore tidal connections. And in either case, all projects must account for changes to soil organic carbon stocks. Igino and Steve will be talking about the greenhouse gas monitoring and accounting later. Next slide, please. Because the soil organic carbon is such an important part of WRC, projects that include the burning of organic soils are not eligible. And to prevent nitrous oxide emissions, nitrogen fertilizers may not be used in the project area. Next slide. There are several conditions designed to prevent leakage. The methodology provides 3 options, one of which must be met. First, that the project area is free of a land use that could be displaced. Either it's been abandoned for 2 years, commercial use is not profitable, and there is no timber harvesting, or new degradation of wetlands will not occur. Or, next slide. Or second, that there is an existing land use that could be displaced, but in this case, baseline emissions from the land use are not accounted for, and degradation of new wetlands will not occur. Or third, that there is an existing land use in the project area, and it will continue at the same or a higher level. Taken together, this set of conditions ensures leakage will not occur. Next slide. There are applicability conditions similar to those for avoiding unplanned deforestation and/or degradation, AUDD. Avoiding unplanned wetland degradation is eligible under certain conditions regarding land use, degradation factors, and agents. Next slide. Similarly, for avoiding planned wetland degradation, APWD, the applicability condition parallels those for avoiding planned deforestation. The conversion of wetlands must be legally permitted. So up to this point, I've covered at a high level many of the applicability conditions. The complete set is in the REDD+ Methodology Framework, and as noted, in most of the modules. I'm going to shift now to talk about additionality. Next slide, please. So additionality is spelled out in BMD 0052, the additionality module, abbreviated ADD-AM. Additionality can be a challenge to demonstrate on a project-by-project basis. So we decided to take a standardized approach for this methodology. Let's start with the outcome, which is that all WRC projects using VM7, both restoration and conservation, including tidal wetlands and seagrasses, are additional. That should probably be bolded and underlined and surrounded with glowing stars. All other projects, such as peatlands, must use a project method to demonstrate additionality. Next slide. So how did we get to this conclusion? The activity method is one VCS approved standardized approach. The activity method seeks to incentivize underutilized approaches to achieving greenhouse gas reductions. We use the activity method to demonstrate additionality for WRC in VM7, and all projects meeting the applicability conditions are on the positive list, which is another way of saying that they are additional. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you through this briefly. As I mentioned, the activity method seeks to incentivize activities with a low level of adoption. We know that tidal wetland and seagrass restoration and conservation are not keeping pace with losses, and global decline is occurring at alarming rates. We analyze the level of restoration and conservation compared to a maximum restoration and conservation potential. The analysis for restoration in the US was included as part of VM33, the tidal wetland restoration methodology that both Hillary and Amy referenced, which put restoration in the US on the positive list. We then compared the level of restoration in the US to the rest of the world, which resulted in all restoration globally being added to the positive list. Now, for conservation activities, we conducted geospatial analysis to determine the level of conservation compared to a maximum potential. And this also resulted in conservation being put on the positive list and hence additional. So collectively, restoration and conservation, all WRC projects using VM7 are additional. There's not time to get into the details of how we did all this, but the additionality module, VMD 52, provides the details of the analysis. And I want to thank and acknowledge Myra Butt for her excellent GIS work while she was a graduate student, which supported the analysis of conservation activities in particular. Thank you, and I will be passing the baton to Igino. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Steve. My name is Igino Emmer, and this presentation is to help you navigate the tidal wetlands procedures. I will not provide much detail on the actual procedures, but Steve Crooks will do so after my presentation. And most of these slides are included for reference if you want to read back after this webinar. And I understand that this presentation will also be made available as a PDF. Next slide, please. So here you see an overview of existing modules within VM7, and it mimics the slide that Amy Schmidt presented on the various kinds of aspects that you find in methodologies. So the backbone of the VM7 methodology is the REDD+ framework, the methodology framework document. And so it gives the general structure of the methodology, and it refers to a large number, and a really large number of modules, which you see presented here as categories. So we have baseline modules, monitoring modules, leakage modules, and so on, as was already shown by Amy. And of course, I thought let me draw the interactions between these modules by adding some arrows, and I quickly stopped that because the slide became unreadable. But I just need to mention that it would not only be arrows between the framework document and the various modules, but also between the modules themselves. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show a number of slides with lists of modules to make you aware of which modules were added, were new, and which modules were significantly changed to include tidal wetlands, and others that had only relatively small edits for let's say bookkeeping related issues. And that by that I mean that we need to make sure that there's a proper link across modules when adding tidal wetlands, and we needed to add certain parameters and add certain equations to make things work. Next slide, please. So these are the baseline modules. In green, you see the ones that have been updated, and in dark green, you see the ones that have significant changes. So you see the light green two at the top. They are the existing baseline modules for planned and unplanned avoided deforestation, and we did some work on those to make them work for tidal wetlands as well. And that was under the notion that baseline processes, land use change processes, are really similar for tidal wetlands projects and terrestrial projects, and we only needed to do some bookkeeping work there. We did some significant work on the ARR module for baselines, and also there's this new module for tidal wetlands. So in the nomenclature of the modules, you see that TW represents tidal wetlands. Next one, please. These are the monitoring modules, and we have well, corresponding with the baseline module, we have been doing some significant work on the ARR module and also on the new tidal wetlands model. Next one, please. This is the list of leakage modules within VM7, and as with the baseline modules, we had to adjust certain procedures for the already existing leakage modules, and we did some significant work on the module for ecological leakage. Next one. Under the miscellaneous modules, you find a very important module is the stratification module, and most of the work we've done on that one is related to effects of sea level rise, and Steve Crooks will explain more about that. And we also added procedures for that were permanence related and also related to the SDT, so which is the soil organic carbon depletion time, and we added the module for the standardized approach for additionality, as just explained by Steve Emmett Mattox. Next, please. These are the carbon pool modules. We didn't work on those. Next one. These are emission modules. Also, not much work done. Next one, please. Tools, they remain the same. Next one. And so those were slides that show the modules that we have introduced, that we have amended slightly and amended significantly. That's for your reference. And now this is just a short list of the pools and sources that are relevant for tidal wetlands. So if you look at the procedures that we added or amended, they will all focus on these four processes. And I will not give any details, but Steve Crooks will on some of these. Next one. Now, given the significant extension of VM7 since it was first published several years ago as a terrestrial REDD methodology, we have seen the addition of restoration, making it really a REDD+ methodology, and the addition of procedures for peatlands. and now the tidal wetlands. So it has become very important to identify which category is relevant for your project activity. And so there are three main categories covered by VM7, which is the original REDD, there is ARR, and now with peatlands and tidal wetlands, there's also WRC as categories. And you can use the methodology for standalone project activities, but you can also use the methodology, and that's really the purpose of this modular thing, of course, is for a combination of these categories. So you can see the list of 5 bullets which show the combinations that you have. So standalone restoration in tidal wetlands, standalone conservation of tidal wetlands, and then there can be a combination of the restoration of wetlands ecosystems with afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, and similarly with forest conservation. And you can also do the conservation of tidal wetlands in combination with the conservation of forest. Next one, please. So the framework document provides a couple of tables which will help you to choose which categories or which category is relevant for your project. And the first table helps you to determine whether you're doing a REDD project activity type. And the second table helps you to determine whether there is suitability for ARR. Next one. And then is the third table, which we extended to include tidal wetlands. And here you see on the left-hand side the pre-project condition, which can be drained, degraded, or undrained and undegraded. And you see that there is a distinction between land covers, like forest and non-forest. And then you have a column with project activities. And if you combine those, you see on the right-hand side in which category or combined category you find yourself. Next one. So which modules are there for tidal wetlands? So we added another table, which is a kind of hideous table, I find myself, but it's very important. And this shows modules and categories and identifies which modules are mandatory for your activity, which are optional for your activity or not applicable. And next slide, please. And here you see as columns the various project categories. You see on the right-hand side the tidal wetlands occurring under RWE AUWD, which is avoided unplanned wetland degradation, and then avoided planned wetland degradation. And as rows, you see the various modules that are part of VM7. And there's a couple of footnotes and stuff, you know, so this is, of course, a very difficult table, but I will help you in a few slides to understand how you use it. Next one, please. So here you see an example. Oh, go back. Oh, one more back. Yes, this one. Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, this one. And so these are the modules that you would use if you would do a standalone ARR project. So this complex methodology with all the modules can also be used for just ARR. And these are then the modules that you would choose. So it's the framework module, and there is the monitoring and the baseline modules for ARR. You have some tools, additionality, uncertainty, and leakage. Next one, please. And this is the situation if you would do ARR on a tidal wetland, which is, for example, if you restore mangroves. And this second set of red squares just show the additional modules that you would have to apply if you would do this combination of RWE and ARR. And here you see, oh, back please. And here you see that you have to use the tidal wetlands modules for the monitoring and for the baseline. And you also see, if you look at the row for TAD, the additionality tool, it switched from the classical tool to the positive list, which got away with just a footnote. I just realized, and it should be more prominent, I guess. But here you see that because you do a restoration project on a tidal wetlands, the activity is deemed additional a priori. Next slide, please. These are the modules you would choose if you do a standalone REDD, for example, an avoided unplanned deforestation degradation project, where you have a couple of tools and slides. You see that if you go to the bottom, you see that you can choose amongst modules that help you calculate carbon stock changes in carbon pools, like above. Oh, what happened? Yeah. And next slide. And this is what you would add in terms of modules if you would do a tidal wetlands conservation project. So again, you would use the positive list for additionality, and you would have to refer to the tidal wetlands modules. And as far as the soil is concerned, you do not use the soil module, which is CPS, as you see at the bottom, but these processes are covered by the tidal wetlands modules. Next slide, please. And if you look at the REDD+ framework document, then these are the high-level equations where you see that the wetlands and particularly the tidal wetlands are covered. This is just for your reference. Next one. So I have just a couple of slides with some details on modules that we worked on. As I mentioned, the stratification module is very important, and Steve Crooks will provide you with some additional details. But here's just to mention that we added procedures to make sure that the project meets some permanence requirements, which, as you may be aware, includes procedures that cover a time period of 100 years. So you need to make sure that if you do a tidal wetlands project, that there is significant difference in terms of carbon stocks between the baseline scenario and the project scenario at the 100-year time mark. And it includes procedures to estimate the soil organic carbon depletion time. Next, please. And it also includes, and Steve has some interesting slides on this, it also includes how you need to deal with the project boundaries if there is sea level rise. And sea level rise, in this case, is not seen as something optional, but it is obviously a given if you run a project for the next decades. And it will have some bearing on the boundaries that you choose for the tidal wetland. Next one. In the ARR modules, we added the harvesting of trees, because we think if you are aware that at some point in time, let's say the mangrove trees that you planted or that you protected, that they may drown and that you may lose that carbon. And this procedure for harvesting trees allows you to indeed remove trees and account for the carbon that can be stored in timber products. It also has some procedures related to sea level rise, and it adds procedures for herbaceous vegetation, because in the classic ARR methodologies you don't see that covered. It's mostly about trees and shrubs. And now we have some procedures for herbaceous vegetation, which might be relevant for tidal marshes, for example. Next, please. And in the module for ecological leakage, we have added a table which helps you design a project so as to avoid ecological leakage to occur. Steve Emmett Mattox mentioned that one of the applicability conditions for these kinds of projects is that you must avoid these processes to occur, because accounting for them will be very difficult or impossible. Next one. And I think this is my last slide. In the module for the baseline module for avoided unplanned deforestation, you find procedures to establish a reference region. Well, what we got back from the field is our own experience, but also from other project developers, is that in certain cases it is very difficult or impossible to meet the requirements for reference regions. So we have worked on relaxing some of the requirements, so that small projects that otherwise would have to implement a very large reference region, or very large projects, for example, that were ecotope wide, that could not find any additional region to function as a reference region, that they can still use the methodology. And this ends my presentation. I give the floor to Steve Crooks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igino. Next slide, please, Ellie. Thank you. And I'm going to take you into the field a little bit and run through, introduce you to the greenhouse gas accounting procedures and the baseline module for tidal wetlands and the monitoring module for tidal wetlands, for working in coastal wetlands like this one. Next slide, please. Now, these are two key modules, VMD 50 and 51. One for the estimation of baseline carbon stock change and greenhouse gas emissions in tidal wetlands restoration and conservation projects, and the other for the monitoring of the same. Now, these modules provide accounting procedures for mineral wetland soils. Accounting procedures for organic soils are found elsewhere in the BL-PEAT and M-PEAT modules. Tidal wetlands also provides procedures for monitoring of key variables when it comes to developing your project. Now, accounting for biomass is also covered in module CPAB and BLAR and MAR for restoration. However, for future submergence to Silvestrum, BL tidal wetlands and M tidal wetlands provides additional procedures for accounting for biomass loss. Next slide, please. Now, there are a number of key definitions which are included here. I will highlight the first two: allochthonous soil organic carbon. And so we provide procedures for a deduction for carbon that's brought in from other parts of the environment into tidal wetlands. And we also provide a definition and procedures for carbon preservation depositional environments. Now, these are basically the sinks that you find downstream of tidal wetlands. And we're recognizing that carbon that comes out of coastal wetlands, tidal wetlands, including seagrasses, can end up in sinks and be preserved. And so we provide procedures and default values for recognizing the preservation potential for carbon that's accumulated off-site. And then there are definitions for mangroves and marshes. Next slide, please. As well as tidal wetlands, which are wetlands, of course, within tidal range, or as well as seagrasses. And we provide a standard definition for wetlands restoration. Next slide, please. Now, a key part of the modules related to tidal wetlands is the consequences of submersion and erosion. And the key driver of this is sea level rise, which can be recognized in the form of wave action, causing erosion at the bottom of the wetlands, but then at a smaller scale, issues like disturbance by boats. Now, carbon stocks from above ground biomass are lost to oxidation. In the baseline, this is conservatively not accounted for. In the project scenario, above ground biomass carbon is immediately and entirely returned to the atmosphere. Now, depending upon the geomorphic setting, soil carbon stocks may be submerged and held intact, or eroded and transported beyond the project area. And we provide procedures for dealing with both of these. I'll skip to the next slide. So this is kind of a key schematic, and it's sort of what I'd like to emphasize is that as with working on peat projects, requirements to engage with a peat scientist, peat wetland scientist. When working on these tidal wetlands, it's important to engage with a geomorphologist or a coastal physical scientist, because the key parameters to recognize are how the coastal systems are going to respond to sea level rise. There'll be some level of building with sea level rise, carbon accumulation associated with that, and there will be migration landwards. And so thinking about the topography to the land and how the boundaries will shift with sea level rise is very important. So we're going to have a system which is going to be moving. But equally, there's going to be erosion potentially at the bottom of the wetland if it's in an exposed area to waves. And so there's a need to account for the loss of project area potentially at the seaward end and the fate of that carbon, unless conservative assumptions are applied. Next slide, please. And I will just mention that the procedures for that are included in the stratification module, so look there. So greenhouse gas emissions from tidal wetlands, soil carbon pools, it's the sum of CO2 emissions and removals. You also factor in methane emissions as well as nitrous oxide emissions. Deductions from CO2 emissions from the soil carbon pool to account for the percentage of carbon stocks that is derived from allochthonous soil organic carbon. And that's the recalcitrant material that comes in from upstream. Now, the general principles for allochthonous carbon soil carbon accounting should only receive credit if carbon would have been returned to the atmosphere in the baseline scenario. Only accounting for recalcitrant allochthonous carbon associated with mineral deposition, and various approaches are provided for this in the modules. Deductions may be conservatively set to 0 in the baseline scenario to simplify the process if we'd like to. Next slide, please. But what we do provide is a simplified way to estimating allochthonous carbon that is suitable for the calculations within the module. And this is provided, and a number of these discussions that we've had today are provided in this Needleman et al. Paper, which was published a couple of years ago. And so from here, based upon calculating the soil carbon percentage within your sediments on your project, you can then calculate from this relationship the allochthonous carbon deduction to subtract from your carbon stock. And so you can see that for mineral soils, low carbon content, this deduction can be very high. But as you increase as effectively as the soils become more peaty, then the deduction decreases. And once you get above 20%, there's no deduction for this carbon pool, allochthonous carbon. Next slide, please. Now, there are a number of defaults provided in these modules. There's a default value for CO2 emissions in areas where they don't have sufficient science to quantify this. And it's based upon the Chimura data set from 2003. And we provide, where Chimura separated out mangroves and marshes, in fact, the IPCC also separated out mangroves and marshes. We looked at the data and decided that there was no real distinction there, and a single default value of 1.46 tons of carbon per hectare per year accumulated is appropriate for both ecosystems. We provide that if wetlands are converted to something else, for mineral soils, it's assumed that that emission takes place over a 20-year period and then diminishes to a steady state of 1.6% carbon within the soils. Organic carbon lost due to oxidation as a percent of this carbon mass presented in eroded wetlands. Now, there are a number of factors. We provide a number of default values here depending upon the environment that the carbon ends up in. There are some areas of good carbon preservation where you might assume only 39% of the carbon that's released from the wetland goes back to the atmosphere, and other settings where 80% of the carbon might go back to the atmosphere. Now, in areas which are isolated from an eroding system, and the carbon remains in the sediments, it just drowns out, you can assume 100% of that carbon remains stored. Next slide, please. And so this is what some of these assumptions are based upon, these default values. And so you see there's a range of different types of environment. The areas which would have low carbon storage potential are normal marine sediments, think of a sandy seabed, or deltaic fluid mud systems. Think of the outer Mississippi Delta, resuspended by hurricanes regularly. Sediment gets exposed to oxygen. High preservation potential areas would be oxygen depleted systems, think of fjords, or areas where you get very high rates of sediment burial that you might find on active margins of continental shelves, for example. So it's helpful for the project if a geomorphologist or marine scientist can classify the marine environment downstream of your project, which will influence the amount of carbon you can recognize as being stored downstream of your wetland project. Next slide, please. So of the last two slides, we go to methane and then nitrous oxide. Here too, there are various approaches for quantifying methane emissions, and we provide some default values based upon the Poffenberger curve of 2011. For low salinity environments, high salinity environments, that above half of seawater, there is a slight amount of methane emitted even under these conditions. And so we have a deduction, a small deduction that should be applied. At the inflection point on the curve, between 18 and 20 points PPT, we have a slightly higher deduction to be applied. However, one of the challenges for projects is that in fresher systems below a salinity of 20 PSU or PPT, we do not provide a default value. The data is not there yet for that kind of relationship. So it will fall upon the project to calculate emissions for those fresher wetlands. Next slide, please. And for nitrous oxide emissions, here too, we provide various approaches for quantifying nitrous oxide, and we provide some default values for open water systems of all salinities, and also for seagrasses, we provide default values. But one key aspect to recognize here is that in systems which are loaded with nitrogen, particularly from agricultural fertilizers, these default values may not apply, as higher nitrous oxide emissions will result, and there will be a need to quantify those emissions appropriately under such nitrogen-loaded systems. And so with that, next slide, I think this draws to the end of our presentation. We'd like to thank you for listening, and I think now we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you all so much. We do have just a couple of questions and just a few minutes here. We've had a couple of questions about applicability, about how these methods apply to mangroves and to subtidal seagrass meadows. So that might be a quick question to address.
Steve, for you.
Is there more to the question, or is it just asking about mangroves?
Just asking, and actually here's one about kelp forests as well. Just wanting to know if these methods apply there.
So no, kelp forests I don't believe would be included in the for this methodology. I know there's some thinking and research going on around those questions. And the methodology does apply for mangroves and for seagrass beds. So I'm not sure specifically. I don't know. Do you know, Steve, do you want to add to that? I'm not sure what the question was about. So
the only thing I would add is yes, for the additionality, they are considered additional for restoration and conservation of the mangroves and the seagrasses. And kelp is actually a subject, now that we've got this out of the way, we are looking at the potential for expanding to recognize conservation and restoration of kelp beds, as well as the potential role of the seaweed farming industry. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Next question. Can projects use other measurements of allochthonous carbon, such as tier 3 type factor, to determine deductions?
Yes, if you can improve upon the default values within the methodologies, we always encourage regional and local science as a preference to default values. So yes, please do so.
Okay. Does this protocol account for both sequestration and avoided loss?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's a simple answer. Yeah. Again, can this methodology apply to mangroves in Mexico? And here's this gentleman has sent his email, and I will get him connected with you. He has some potential project ideas.
Great.
Yes.
I wonder if you could expand a bit on the issue of non-permanence in tidal wetlands caused by negative climate change impacts. I noted that no amendments to the AUWD non-permanence tool have been made, but that you cover SLR elsewhere. Do you also cover non-permanence due to increasing water temperatures? Am I to reread that?
No, I think that's good. Do you want to add anything here, Igino, or shall I jump in? Okay. Yes, when developing the baseline scenario for the project, you have to think about the permanence issue related to the site. And so that could be sea level rise or any other parameter that might affect permanence. And you know, this could be a real challenge for projects because you're looking 100 years out. Of course, things get updated as you move forward. But yes, ultimately, you have to think through and develop your conceptual models of how the site is going to evolve under the baseline condition, and then compare that against the project. And any parameter that might affect carbon storage and preservation should be factored in.
Hold on, and Amy, do you want to add something on the work that the VCS or Verra is now doing with respect to how to deal with sea level rise? And maybe because what I can add is that there's concern amongst project developers about applying these procedures. It's as Steve mentioned, is you need some expertise there, and we are trying to apply, or not trying, we are applying the procedures to a project in Pakistan. It's not easy. We think it's doable, but it's not so straightforward, and you have to make choices. So to make this easier for project developers, there is now considering these to move these procedures in methodologies to an actual non-permanence risk assessment. Amy, can you add something on that?
Yeah, thanks, Igino. So we are considering updating, or actually moving forward with updating the non-permanence risk tool for the VCS program, as Igino mentioned, to incorporate sea level rise as a risk in that tool. So currently it's included in methodologies and in the quantification, or like estimated sea level rise is included in the quantification of emission reductions and removals. And it will be moved more into the non-permanence risk tool as a risk of carbon stock loss. So we're currently undertaking that work to update that tool.
All right, I want to thank you all so much. The questions are still coming in, but I think we have run out of time. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, and remind there have been a lot of questions about getting a copy of the slides and a recording of this event. So again, this has been recorded, and I will be posting that recording to the YouTube channel that belongs to Restore America's Estuaries. So if you go to YouTube and search for that, it will come up. We'll have it up by the end of the week, and I will make the slides available to everyone who's been here, and I will make sure that we can get them posted on our website as well, so folks can have access to that as a resource. Again, thank you everyone for attending, for your kind attention. If you have any questions or potential project ideas, I encourage you to get in touch with our panelists or email me back, and I will happily play matchmaker there. So thanks again. A warm thank you to all of our speakers today.